Good evening, everyone. My name is Sandra Collins, and I'm the Director of the National Library of Ireland. It's my great honour to welcome you all to this online event, the second in our Living with Pride programme. Living with Pride is a flagship project for the National Library this year. It represents a commitment to diversity and inclusion, and specifically to LGBTI+. We hope that through this project, we'll raise awareness of the Irish Queer Archive and the LGBTI+ collections which we care for in the National Library. These collections form part of the memory of Ireland, and it is an honour to hold them in trust and to find ways to explore and promote them and to encourage people to engage with and be inspired by them. There are a number of elements to Living with Pride. Today is the second in the Living with Pride year-long programme of events. This programme is co-curated by Tonie Walsh, and it's an ambitious and wide-ranging series of conversations. And we look forward to the many conversations that will be created by the programme. In June, we'll launch the Living with Pride exhibition. This is an exhibition of the Christopher Robson Photographic collection, which contains over 2,000 slides, mostly taken at Pride events in Ireland between 1992 to 2007. This collection was donated to the National Library by Christopher's partner, Bill Foley, and Bill has worked to co-curate the exhibition with us. The photographs are all fully digitised and available to view in our online catalogue. And the exhibition will be on site in the National Photographic Archive and also online, so people can explore it regardless of where they are or what the COVID-19 restrictions are at the time. The third part of the project is that we're delighted to be partnering with Curt International Festival of Literature to have Sean Hewitt as our first poet in residence based at the Irish Queer Archive, where he'll explore some of the stories contained in that archive through poetry. Overall, our approach throughout has been to be guided by the principle of nothing about us without us. And I'm hugely grateful to our co-curators, Bill and Tonie, and all our partners, and to ShoutOut, who provided training throughout for our teams. And I'd also like to thank the great staff in the National Library who've worked very hard on this. We also recognise that there is much more to do in our diversity and inclusion programme, and we'll be continuing to work on this in the coming years. So now, the moment you're waiting for, I'm delighted to introduce our speakers tonight for this In Conversation style event. Aifric Ní Chríodáin has been involved with ShoutOut since it began in 2012, first as a volunteer and graphic designer, and now as their development manager. ShoutOut is a registered charity working to provide LGBTQ+ inclusive education in schools and beyond. Aifric is also a member of the board of Gays International LGBTQ+ Film Festival. And prior to her time at ShoutOut, Aifric worked in music, film and television, and higher education. Bill Foley came out at the age of 17 at a time when gay male sexual activity was criminalised. He became actively involved in LGBT organisations within a few years of coming out. He was co-editor of National Gay Federation News, NGF News, and a founder member of the Dublin Lesbian and Gay Men's Collectives. He helped organise protests connected with the murders of Charles Self and Declan Flynn. He moved into medical social work in his mid-30s and worked with people with HIV and AIDS in the area of sexual health for the rest of his professional life. He has been involved in the founding of many HIV organisations, including Gay Health Action, Dublin AIDS Alliance, AIDS Helpline Dublin, Carja, and also participated in Gay Health Network. He's currently a board member of Gay Health Network and a volunteer with Empower. Bill was in a relationship with Christopher Robson for 35 years. Aifric and Bill, I'm really delighted to hand the stage over to you both.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and thank you, Bill. I'm just going to stop sharing this lovely photo of Bill and Christopher now, and I guess ask you, Bill, maybe the most important question, which is if you could tell us a little bit about who Christopher was as a person and as an activist and as a photographer.
Okay. Not an easy task to summarize all those things up. Well, Christopher was very handsome, as you can see from the photographs I've just hung up behind me here, and the spread of those photographs span about 25 years. The upper one is of him in Norway, that I took him there to try and see the Northern Lights when he was 70, and the lower one is when we were in Spain when he was about in his early 40s, I think. He was a very cultured individual, a very educated person, a wide breadth of knowledge. He claimed to be middle class, but certainly myself and other people would have put him very firmly in the upper class bracket, however reluctantly. He went to college. His father was an architect, and initially, because of his interest in astronomy, he decided to do physics and spent a couple of years doing that before moving again into a more generalist degree, and then kind of also studying kind of various art projects to the side, including sculpture and photography. And then he moved into architecture, which kind of reinforced his kind of appreciation of visual media and the visualization of the social world and so on. He was an avid reader, and the breadth of his knowledge kind of extended throughout his life. And a writer too in the early times, when he would write many letters to the Irish Times. And also they used to run literary short story competitions, and he regularly won those competitions if his mother indeed wasn't winning them. I think his mother won more competitions than he did, much to his annoyance. When he was doing his master's, I mean, his master's was on alphabetical voting, the voting system in Ireland, and he later published that with Tonie Walsh, and it became a touchstone that a lot of commentators used in elections since. I think it's still being used actually now in relation to the impact of your status of your name on the electoral register or election paper rather. He also was interested in sailing, and he lived in London for a time after he started, after he graduated, and worked there for about 10 years before coming home, and he would regularly come back to do sailing ventures. One of them was a sail trip around Ireland where he and friends, architect friends, sailed around the coast of Ireland. But of course, he was taking photographs at the same time. And it being one of Christopher's photographic sessions, he of course made a slideshow out of it. And the slideshow ended up being shown in a public venue in the RDS that was open to the public. So he ended up giving a huge slideshow to half Dublin on the images that he made from the trip around Ireland. So I think at that stage the photography bug was well and truly there, and he has been kind of regaling us all with slideshows ever since, from holidays, from pride events, from parties, from whatever it was, you name it, he was taking photographs of it. And I think that's where the photographic kind of bug came from. So I think that's where he came into photography. I hope I have answered some of those parts of the question for you there, I think.
And when or how did you realize how valuable his collection of photographs from Pride and from the community were?
I like in the early days, he had sold some of his photography commercially. He was part of a slide file in Dublin, and I suppose it was pre phone cameras where the standard of photography generally wasn't very great, and regularly people's holiday snaps would either cut off their feet or their heads or whatever. So good photography was a rarity, and great photography was even rarer still. So the slide file was an outlet for him to kind of showcase his photography, and several of his images began to be used in books and in calendars and in public campaigns. So there was an appreciation of the value of his photography. He never really took photographs of early LGBT events when we became active in the scene. So he really started in 1992. There was an ILGA conference in Paris, and he went there as a representative with Kieran Rose. And during that conference, there was a stage demonstration outside the Mexican embassy in Paris about the way gay people were treated in Mexico at the time. And there ended up being a clash between the protesters and the police there. And Christopher has taken several photographs of that, and they, in fact, some of those are now in the exhibition. So they kind of opened the exhibition. And 92 was the first year that he kind of was deliberately taking, if you like, LGBT events. And then the remainder of the 15 years are mostly focused on the Dublin Prides. There are some New York, and there's one of Sligo, but mostly it's the Dublin Prides. There are, and because of the rarity, I suppose, of good photography, I suppose there was a sense in which what he was doing increasingly over the years was kind of putting together a fairly unique kind of record of what prides were like, who was there, what people were wearing, how they were looking, what kind of placards and protests and messages that they might be putting forth where. And so increasingly talk began to be around the idea of donating them to an archive. And I suppose Christopher was a bit of a procrastinator, so he needed quite a bit of encouragement about it. And I think he began to put the collection together in 2008 and only just about finished it in 2010 or something, just year before he died. So it was an ongoing kind of project. I think we all felt it was a useful archive in thinking about it for posterity. The idea that it would be an archive that would be something that our current generations would be interested in, I don't think really occurred to us so much. But it's great to see that the exhibition is going ahead, and the work that's been put into it by the NLI is really much appreciated. And I have to say I'm very excited about seeing it up and running and seeing all those wonderful images around the walls of the NLI in Temple Bar.
And as well as being an archivist and a photographer and building this amazing collection, Christopher was extremely actively involved in activism within the community and in a number of the major groups within the community, as of course you were too. And you've got the kind of activists collection of badges there behind you, which I think everyone has kind of built up. But how did you and Bill, or how did you and Christopher each get involved in activism originally, or how did you come to activism within the movement?
Well, I came out at 17, and I suppose before then I had been involved in religious organizations that were helping people. So it was St. Vincent de Paul, working with the elderly in their own homes kind of thing. And so I had a kind of vague background about that. I also joined the ICCL when I was still a student. So I had a kind of social conscience from an early age. And then I came out at the age of 17, and within a year or so, I was volunteering with the Irish Gay Rights Movement, which was the main organisation that was open at the time. And that had a huge centre in Parnell Square, which was a great resource for groups to meet in, it had a disco and socials and so on. And one of the socials actually was a regular monthly cheese and wine kind of party on Sunday afternoons. And that's actually at one of those where Christopher and myself met. But I started off doing things like helping out in the coffee shop, and kind of then went on to look at managing the kind of newsletter, and then went on to do the NLGF newsletter later. And then in 1982, when there was a conference in Dublin that involved in meeting up with other like-minded people, and out of that, the Dublin Lesbian and Gay Men's Collectives were founded. And both Christopher and myself had met each other by then, and we both signed up to be founder members of that. And Christopher came out late. He was maybe 35, I think, when he came out. We both came out in the same year, 1975. So there's quite a bit of an age difference between us, but I like to tell people that we were the same gay age. So we knew the same people, the same cohort of people coming out at the same time, which was an enormous kind of benefit. And a lot of the people we met through activism, we met as a couple. So there are loads of friends that we met then that didn't know either of us beforehand. But I mean, Christopher, I think, had struggles with his sexuality over the years. He fought with depression, was treated with depression and so on over the years. And I mean, horrifically, I think at one stage, one psychiatrist said to him, you know, when he was talking about the doubts around his sexuality, you know, maybe what you need to do is find a woman that you like very much, but make sure that she's a very attractive woman. And so the idea of that being said these days is completely horrific. And so rather than helping, it actually added to Christopher's confusion. And when he was in London, he had a series of relationships with women there. And there was always that niggly kind of question in his mind about it. And then he came back to Dublin and came out in Dublin, as I say, at the age of 35. I mean, while in London, he had kind of dabbled into explorations around his sexuality, and went to a meeting of the Gay Liberation Front, which was a big organization at the time. And I remember him telling the story where he turned up at the meeting kind of not knowing what he was there for and what he was expecting. But there was a couple on the stage with a man and a woman, and they were stereotypically flower power hippies, with the man much older than the woman, and he had a very long beard and scraggly hair and so on. And of course, it was the man who was talking about, you know, sexuality and sexual politics. And at the end of his speech, kind of announced to the audience that the two of them, the man and the woman who were presented before the crowd, were a radical lesbian couple. And and that sent Christopher way back into the closet. So he, you know, he had probably reason not to come out earlier. But when he came out, I met him a few years after he came out and after I came out. And we got on like a house on fire. In fact, after that meeting in Parnell Square, we kind of walked hand in hand across the city to Dawson Street. So realized later that obviously that was the future path of the Pride March from Parnell Square to government buildings. But I think he was initially reluctant to become involved in activism, and I suspect that was to do with the struggle in relation to his sexuality, that when he finally came to it and he was very happy with it, he stopped being depressed, he stopped the medication and so on. And I'd love to claim that I'm a cure for depression, but I think it was really becoming sexually assertive and self-actualized and living his true self that actually enabled him to become the person he did in terms of his activism.
And I guess to go back to that time as well, because it's funny now, there's this almost kind of mythology narrative around Pride that it began in 1983 with the protests around Declan Flynn. And I think a lot of people today think that that's where it all started and when it all started. But you and Christopher had been involved before that, and what kind of actions and protests had been happening before 1983 and before those protests?
Well, I was involved with a group called Gays Against Repression, which was a small kind of radical grouping that was looking to kind of, I suppose, in a way, shock people into some sort of recognition of LGBT lives at the time. It was a very small group of people. So, I mean, I remember one year we sat at the main gates of Stephen's Green at the top of Grafton Street, kind of singing, "We're here because we're queer, because we're here because we're queer." And people wandering by were simply baffled, what the hell are they doing? I mean, I suppose it was so radical at the time, we didn't get any abuse. People were just kind of stunned that, are those lunatics doing there? And then, in subsequent years, we did things like walk down Grafton Street when it was still open to traffic and kind of greet people saying Happy Pride and handing out pink carnations and so on. And then, after we formed the Dublin Lesbian Gay Men's Collectives, there was a slightly more serious attempt to organise Pride alongside the NLGF. We sort of co-produced them over the years. And so I think the first one of a serious nature probably happened in 81, and that was 81 or 82, probably 81 after the first national LGBT conference in Cork in 1980. We had a follow-up conference in 81 in Dublin, and I think it was that both kicked off the collectives and also probably the pride movements. So they were quite small. I mean, if we got 200 people on them at that stage, we were lucky. But then, the collectives were involved in a whole range of actions and protests and activities. And so when the Fairview murder happened with Declan Flynn, everybody was horrified about it, but there was some satisfaction in the sense that the perpetrators had been found and were being put forward to the courts. But the horror returned when the sentences were handed down as kind of the Probation Act with no serious regard to the nature of the crime that had been committed. And in fact, the judge had said at the time, this could never be regarded as a crime. So, I mean, it actually got national publicity, the leniency of the sentence. We were outraged in the collective, so we decided to do a march of protest. And one of the things that the collective had done, I suppose, was to build alliances on the broad left in various movements, including the anti-amendment campaign. So we had made friends on the left, and there was a cross-fertilization of ideas and protest ideology and sexual politics and workers' politics and so on. All of those were intermingling within feminism, within civil rights activism. And those strong links enabled us to call on all of those organizations for the Fairview Pride March, because we were terrified in organizing it that we would be subject in a small group to violence, maybe in the local community, because we had decided to march to Fairview rather than the usual march of going to government buildings. And while everybody completely felt that was the right idea and the right decision, there was a huge degree of nervousness about it. I think it was the first march that ever in the history of Ireland started on time, to such an extent that we ended up having a trailing march of latecomers who came after us. But we ended up getting a lot of people, something short of 1,000 people, and there was a great sense of solidarity in that, and that kind of anger and solidarity kind of enabled us to move on to Pride that year, which was a much bigger Pride than it had been in previous years. So in a way, I can see why some people would regard that as the start of Pride, in the sense that it was the start of the larger Prides. But I suppose the Prides did go into a kind of hiatus at the end of the 80s and didn't revive again until 1992. So that was the progression of it.
And even in some of Christopher's photos from the 90s, you can see, for example, there's a photo of teachers who are hiding their faces behind placards, and it says it's for fear that their jobs will be at risk if they're seen to be at Pride or if they're seen to be LGBT. And for many of the attendees who would have had careers and who would have been in public life, who would have been afraid to be seen, do you think that people felt vulnerable at the time? And do you think that there was much of a reaction that was maybe negative to those who would have attended Pride at the time?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the very early small ones, there was a huge sense of vulnerability of the people marching. And as it became more of an established event, some people would line the streets. Now, you'd get things thrown at you, like verbally rather than physical things, but there were slurs, comments, and I think at one point there was a counter demonstration one year. But like it did take a lot to kind of walk down the street with a banner in your hand saying, you know, homosexuals are revolting, or whatever phrase you were kind of favouring at the time. A lot of people lined the streets to watch it. You know, lined the streets, I suppose, more of a modern phenomenon, but there were groups of people at the point where the march was passing who were stopping to observe it. And a lot of LGBT people also stood in the sidelines to watch the march go by. And based on how big it was or what kind of response it was getting, would then join in. So we regularly found that the march that ended up was a lot bigger than the march that started off there. And I think that, you know, there's still a kind of level of outedness that you bring to Pride. I mean, it's become a huge celebration of your sexuality, but there's a kind of large range of dress styles that people use in their most flamboyant, most outrageous, most sexual. And there has to be an accommodation by everybody of that whole range of imagery that people are seeing as the parade walks by. So I think for people who walk it, there is still that sense of, you know, exposure and, you know, vulnerability that can sometimes happen even in a march as big as it's become these days.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, that's very much true, that people will still express themselves in a way on Pride, which might put them at risk in some ways, no matter how secure they may be or how secure we may think them to be. They will still maybe take those risks on that day because of what it is and what it represents, and because they feel connected to that kind of history as well. And some of, I think, the most interesting photos or the most striking photos in the exhibition and in the collection aren't just from Dublin. They're some of the photos from New York and from Paris. And some of the photos from New York of ACT UP are just incredibly composed and so dynamic. And then the photos from Paris are striking in a different way, because you've got this police violence. You've got people like Kieran Rose caught up in the violence, and they're quite dark and they're quite shocking. But I guess I was wondering how Christopher himself was influenced by attending these events abroad and by working with other activists abroad.
Yeah, we both were representing Ireland in international agencies in relation to HIV. Like when Gay Health Action was founded in 1985, it was the first organisation to look at HIV and address HIV in Ireland. We were ahead of the curve here in terms of kind of providing information to the gay male community in putting out safer sex advice and condom distributions and so on. And we realized early on that obviously we need to make alliances in other places. And it was a way of checking out that what we were doing was kind of on the right track, and also sharing our own imagery and information with others abroad. We did a study in 1988 about the effect of our messaging on the gay male population. There was a huge kind of shift in sexual behavior in terms of uptake of condom use and so on, which was a very positive kind of feedback thing that we had for ourselves. And that was a useful thing to be able to share internationally. I mean, we joked among each other that the representation happened on class lines. So Christopher was a member of Eurocastle, and he got to go to meetings in Paris and Prague and come back with fantastic stories of, you know, wonderful parties and so on that happened there. Whereas I got to places like Newcastle and came back with stories of brown ale or whatever. But there was a serious work going on, and I think Christopher was honing his highly developed lobbying skills. And within Eurocastle, there was a building up of lobbying documentation that would colour how Europe dealt with LGBT people. And he was vital in a submission of a document that amended legislation, European-wide legislation that incorporated the word sexual orientation in an anti-discriminatory bill. So it was hugely influential. And actually, I was contacted by a person from that organization just before Christmas there who was writing a book about the experiences and wanted to find a piece of information that linked both Christopher and Eurocastle to that lobbying achievement. And I was able to confirm that, in fact, I had found that document and had donated it to the NLI as part of the document submission that I subsequently made myself to them. And so that document now is going to form part of that research, which will have both Christopher and indeed Irish activists kind of recognised in that way. But we were also, I mean, in terms of myself in the British organisation, obviously the Deterrence Against Trust was a hugely important HIV organisation there. And it was a bridge to bringing back information that they were developing as well as sharing information that we had. And so it was really, again, that cross-fertilization of ideas that enriched, you know, all of our campaigns.
And then closer to home, what were the campaign priorities for the groups that you and Christopher worked with? So like Glen, the NLGF, Gay Health Action, what would you have been working on during the time that the photos are taken?
Well, so, I mean, I worked with IDRM and NLGF, and Christopher worked with the Switchboard, which was part of the NLGF kind of series of organizations. But when we moved to the collective, it was a progression, you know, away from those organizations in some way. You know, I still straddle them a little bit, which was sometimes a difficult position to be in. But largely the time that we're talking about, the organization that was to the forefront for me was Gay Health Network, and for Christopher was obviously Glen, and he became kind of one of the forerunners of Glen. I mean, you know, obviously it's very sad that Glen organization kind of closed, and particularly in the way it closed. But I think it's one of the main contributors to LGBT life that we've ever had from an activist organization. I think the achievements are kind of unprecedented and incomparable to anything else that people achieved. And Christopher would have said about it that it was my life's work. You know, that's how strongly he felt about that. I mean, for Glen, obviously, the Norris case had been won in Europe, but after that, there was no response or action really taken from the Irish government. And so there was a group called, it was Don Donnelly and Donald Traynor invited a range of us to their house in Inchicore. And we were sitting around talking about the idea that kind of law reform had sort of fallen into the doldrums, and was there something that we could do about this? So there was a general discussion about possible actions that could take place, and it was decided that what was needed was a new kind of organization that would take up the cudgel, if you like, of developing legislative reform for LGBT people. And that's where Glen was founded. And so kind of took off from there. So it started off really with the kind of focus of trying to get the law reform case approved in Ireland. So it developed a huge lobbying program. It did consultation meetings with the community. It met with politicians for lobbying and so on. And obviously it culminated in the passing of the law reform in 1993. And that was really a transformative movement. It was kind of a moment. It was a euphoric thing, I suppose. I remember when we were on the 1993 march, we were still kind of high from the fact that law reform had just been passed. And we were chatting along the way and reminiscing about other kind of actions and protests that had happened. And Christopher said, we're not demanding, we don't have to demand anything anymore. Previous marches have been, what do we want? Equal rights, when do we want them now? What do we want? The right to choose, when do we want it now? What do we want? Equal pay, what do we want it now? So all those slogans, and suddenly he was realizing we're not chanting anything. And I said, well, what could we chant? And he said, well, what did we want? Equal rights. When did we get them? Yesterday. And that ended up being taken over a little bit from the whole parade. And it was a completely euphoric moment, really amazing kind of thing. So that celebration went on. I mean, obviously then Glen came back and looked at its own agenda and realised obviously there was a lot more areas for law reform within the brief. Obviously, the ultimate goal was marriage equality. That began to be something that people could talk about at that stage. I mean, it was prior to that, it was kind of inconceivable that you would even have that kind of discussion. But they did end up kind of being responsible for a whole raft of kind of important kind of pieces of legislation, including the Employment Equality Act in '88 and the Equal Status Act in 2000, and then the Civil Partnership in 2010, which I know was very controversial, but I think it was what was feasible at the time. There were certainly opinion polls that were taken that would have suggested that the marriage wouldn't have been possible at that stage, and it would have required a constitutional referendum that wouldn't have been won. And so this was a bridging kind of thing to equal marriage that obviously, again, happened in 2015. So it was completed the legislative program, if you like. It's an amazing achievement. I was involved mostly from the HIV side of things with the network, and so what we were doing was kind of building services, building relationships with other service organizations nationally, comparing kind of what was needed and kind of developing both lobbying skills and campaigns, informational campaigns of safe sex and so on for the gay male community, particularly on the Man-to-Man website.
And I guess just kind of the last thing I want to ask about is about Pride itself. And I think that people who come and see these photos will really get a sense of how much Pride has changed and how much it has grown into such a huge affair and something which is so endorsed kind of across society from companies and from state bodies. But back then it was that bit smaller and it was that bit more community focused, and it maybe didn't take over the airwaves or didn't take over RTE or didn't take over cultural bodies in the way it does now. And I was wondering what it's been like to see those changes from the perspective of having been there at the beginning.
I think it's amazing. I mean, I know people kind of complain that it's too large, but, if you come from a situation where it was a small group of people walking down Grafton Street, large is good, And I think the bigger prides also enable us to kind of take a platform because it now gets publicity. So we can we can use it to kind of promote whatever message is important at that time. I mean, despite all the advantages, we still have issues to deal with. You know, there's still a rise in the number of kind of queer bashings and so on around, and young people being harassed in school even, because obviously the greater the visibility we've developed for ourselves, the more people are being identified as LGBT at a younger age and suffering kind of discriminatory kind of bullying as a result of that. And so I think the bigger prides give us a platform to do that. I also understand that the pride committees would be kind of in ongoing kind of discussions with the people who are the commercial agencies who are sponsoring it to, you know, more than just sponsor the event every year, to maybe put into place things like LGBT support groups within their agencies, and hopefully encouraging them to become LGBT champions. Now, I know it's all very idealized, but I think that the larger the platform we have, the more able we are to negotiate those things with the commercial sponsors.
And it's funny now when we work with companies or when we work with schools, even more so, so much of what we use actually comes back from Glen documents and from Glen resources. And our main Bible is the kind of Glen Schools LGBT resource, which is still just invaluable in terms of the advice it gives. We're going to come to the questions now in a minute, but before we do, I think, Bill, we might finish in some of Christopher's own words.
Yes, I mean, Christopher was obviously more articulate than me, so I thought it would be better to get a sense of what he might be saying about this. And this was actually an article that was published in GCN in 2008. So, sorry, here goes. 25 years of Pride marches. Dear God, time doesn't just fly by, it speeds up as well. As my sister tells me, Christmas now comes every 6 weeks, and so clearly does Pride. But I've always loved Christmas, and I've always got a kick out of our own June festival. Pride started both as a commemoration and a celebration of the Stonewall Uprising in June 1969, and has always had this dual aspect, an assertion of our rights and a celebration of our achievements. I do remember reading about those riots in New York, but at the time I didn't think that they had anything to do with me. Gradually it became clear to me that they did indeed, and I became part of the growing Dublin social and political scene, a scene so small that people could and did invite everyone back on a Saturday night for a party. Various small pride and protest marches had been held before, but the real birth of was the Fairview March in 1983. On a cold, windy March day, some 800 people walked behind the flags and banners from the Custom House to Fairview Park to register our outrage at the suspended sentences given to those who had kicked and beaten to death a gay man in Flynn. It wasn't just LGBT people, civil rights groups, political parties and movements, many friends from the anti-amendment campaign in which lesbians and gays worked in numbers. The Fairview March gave us the impetus to have a real Pride March in June the same year. Lesser numbers, perhaps 400, but this time a celebration of our community through Dublin Centre, as well as a notification of the real injustices we suffered. After all, most of the men who marched were criminals. Numbers fell again in 84, and by 85 the event was fizzling out. The march has passed into legend, a grim, hilarious legend in 1985. Some 25 people walked behind a small van with a tape recorder playing music, which was winding down. Sing if you're glad to be gay. A few people were. It's a measure of how awful the 1980s were. Unemployment, huge emigration, particularly among LGBT people, and the strident right-wing groups winning referendums and lording it over everyone. A new decade and a new energized group got the 1992 march into shape, and it has never looked back. The best for many of us was in the day after the Dáil had abolished the old criminal laws and had brought in an equal age of consent. In brilliant sunshine, we shouted, what did we want? Equality. When did we get it? Yesterday. Still possibly the happiest day of my life. We ended up on the steps of the central bank for speeches and partying, while the dice man did a full striptease. Tom McGinty, sadly missed. We were told we could never use those steps again, and shortly afterwards they railed the whole place in. Well worth it. Memories of the next 15 years? Confused, happy, wet. There were several downpours. What I've always enjoyed is our own diversity among Ireland's categorised diverse groupings. Young and old, well, not too many, serious and raucous, preppy students and drabber politicals, me, forthright lesbians and quieter gays, and lots of drag queens. Quite right too. During the Stonewall uprising, it was pretty clear that it was a drag queen who threw the first handbag, and pretty clear that it was lesbians who flung the first bricks. We started off disreputably, and for some of us who have since become respectable, that was a deliberate political tactic. All welcome, though, that's the point. The best part is to have watched the march grow bigger and more confident, more colourful, to have become an essential element in the vivid regrowth of Dublin. Over the years, I have recorded much of the colour and exuberance of this on camera. Some 3,000 slides now, all in order, ready for inclusion in the Queer Archive. You may have seen me over the years festooned with lenses, black jacket, increasingly balder, greyer, heavier, and pointing my camera at you. You've been warned.
That is absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Christopher, which I think that piece sums up more than we could have anticipated and more relevant even than he could have realised. We do have some questions here, and I would really encourage people to submit more questions through the chat function or through the Q&A. But the first question was from Maureen, and she said, Bill, it's so wonderful to hear you honouring Christopher in the NLI's and national memory in this way. Please, can you say something about how Christopher's social activism and passion for equality, such as Anna Liffey, as well as LGBT issues, affected his photography?
Yes, I mean, thanks, Maureen. He photographed everything, as I say. I went through various phases of it over the while. I think it was the early involvement in the ICCL that kind of built a social consciousness, but for both of us. I think, I was involved in, or a member of, rather than involved, a member of ICCL from when I was in my late teens, and Christopher was, I think, at the same time. But I never remember seeing him at meetings or anything like that. I think it's bizarre that was there. But I mean, his skills were very well regarded. I mean, he had a very good way of approaching problems and a very rational kind of approach to a very reasonable kind of argumentative style. You know, if you came across one of Christopher's letters, he had a way of positioning his opponent into so that it was difficult for them to get out of the corner he had placed them in. And I think that others recognized that, so he was co-opted onto the board of Anna Liffey and kind of did a huge amount of work in building up that organization for people with drug use, and it was a unique kind of forum for that. He was a passionate advocate in his work, in his own work. He was an architect in the Department of Agriculture, and people always joked about him, oh, do you design cowsheds? And actually, in a way, he did. But more importantly, he was the person who wrote the specifications for all the EU grant-aided farms, and therefore both Irish agriculture and the Irish landscape is a benefit from that. As a result of that, he was made an honorary member of the Irish Landscape Institute, I think, in 1998 or something like that. So his breadth of commitment to the environment and to projects is widespread, which reflects his depth of knowledge and wealth of experience.
And we have another question here. Maybe I missed it, but why, Bill, were you, do you think, able to come out at a relatively young age at 17 in the early 1980s?
Well, I mean, for some people, I think exploring their sexuality is fairly easy. I mean, I knew from when I was young that I was different and gay and so on. I think my friends and family did. I mean, I was one of those quiet, studious boys that was constantly jeered at school and would have been called queer long before I knew what it was myself. And so coming out was kind of, in a way, it was easy. You kind of get sexually aroused when you see or think about men and so on. And I think for others, that kind of attraction was kind of more deeply suppressed, which leads to kind of mental health problems, the kind of depression that Christopher sort of experienced with. So I think I didn't have any of that. I mean, I knew I loved women and so on, but I knew I didn't love women in that way. And so it was an easier decision maybe for me, coming out to myself and coming out onto the scene. Coming out to the family was a bit more problematic, with my father saying, "Don't darken the doorstep again." But thankfully that improved over the years. Christopher is from a slightly different generation. I mean, he's 17 years older than I, so I do think it makes a difference. And I think the dominance of the church in ideology back then it still is, to my mind, far too much. But back then, it's probably hard for young people particularly, to conceive of what it was like to even think outside the box was a problem. So I do think it contributed to lots of mental health problems.
We have a question, speaking of the scene, here from Fergus about your activism on the dance floor, Bill. And your days touring the country's discos must have made quite an impression in the dance halls in more rural areas. He recalls you and Christopher claiming that space in quite a remarkable manner.
Well, I suppose when Christopher and I met in the IGRM and that cheese and wine party, part of the kind of, we had an instant connection and the chat was free flowing. But part of the chat was at one point me sort of lecturing him about photography and him sort of lecturing me about dance, whereas I was, at the time, I was a disco dancing champion and I was kind of being paid to wander around, do kind of bad impersonations of John Travolta around the country. And after I met Christopher, we were in a relationship. He was driving me and my dance troupe around the country, so he became our roadie for a bit. So it was kind of odd. I think what Fergus is talking about is my family had a caravan in Cortown, and we used to go down there regularly for visits. And there was a big dance club there, and I liked dancing. Christopher liked dancing. So, we decided to go on a couple of occasions. And on one occasion, I mean, we were all just free dancing. It wasn't like a lurch or a waltz. We were probably two meters away from each other, socially distant dancing. But nonetheless, a couple of security men came in and grabbed Christopher by the scruff of the neck and frog marched him out of the disco. And I was sort of slightly oblivious to all this, still in my groove. And it took me a while to figure out that had happened. And we were furious. And we went around to the local hotel, who also happened to be having a disco. And just in defiance, we decided to dance our heads off. And to such an extent that everybody who was there sat down in the chairs circulating the dance floor and applauded us. So we had a completely the opposite reaction in the same night. It was a very memorable evening.
That is causing a splash on the dance floor. Two final questions. So just one from Elizabeth Kerwin. What advice would you give to young LGBT people who feel that Ireland rejects them?
That's a very difficult question. I think it's an issue for now. I mean, I think it's particularly an issue now for now, as I say, because the harassment against younger people has increased. I think because of the successes we've had over the years, we're now kind of facing something of a backlash about it, and people are getting more. And I do think that younger LGBT people are getting more instances of physical abuse and so on. But there is a kind of growing awareness about this and a need to kind of develop services around it. And Belong To is a wonderful organization that targets young people and brings them into support services and so on. I do think we still need to have an all-encompassing kind of political ideology that feeds our actions, and mine would be socialism. That we need to have not just a redistribution of wealth, but also redistribution of opportunity. And I think that's something that's hopefully feeding into the younger organizations that will help address some of the problems that are being faced now.
And then just the last question from Carol. Which is your own favorite of Christopher's photos, if it's possible for you to choose?
There are so, there's so many. He has so many photographs. I suppose I fought a little bit with not with very much resistance with Carol and Nikki in curating the exhibition from the NLI's perspective to include photographs other than LGBT ones. But there's a small collection of his photographs of landscape and architecture and so on in that. So, picking one favorite photograph of his would be impossible. In terms of the exhibition, it's a particular selection of the larger collection, and within that there is a photograph of drag queens are on a float. And you can't see the drag queens. The only part of them you can see is their shoes, their red shoes, as they're on swings on the float and they're coming into shot from the right. Behind them is a bus, and there are three women, elderly women, on the upper floor of the bus, looking down at the gatherings in Parnell Square of all these amazing people with fantastic costumes and looking at the drag queens on the swing. And the first woman is completely enraptured with laughter, and the second one is slightly uncertain, and the third one is frowning down on them. And I think that picture says so much in terms of his skill at capturing an image of that nature in such a busy environment, and also how much it says about Irish society and how far we've come as an LGBT organization in looking at that image. And so I suppose I would veer towards that one as the favorite one within the exhibition.
And I can't wait for the exhibition to open and for us all to get a chance to see it properly, and for everyone who's been here this evening to be able to see the exhibition as well, because it really is something absolutely beautiful. And hopefully, Sandra, you can tell us a little bit more about how that might come to pass.
So thank you so much, Aifric and Bill. That was really, really lovely. This is our second event in the programme, and what I'm really struck by is the level of warmth and really positive response. Like, people just really enjoyed this. So thank you very, very much. I think Bill has done a great job of whetting the appetite to see the photographs and see the exhibition. So we are planning to open in June, and really, really excited about it. We'll open in the National Photographic Archive in Temple Bar, so that's the physical exhibition, and we'll also open online. So we'll have an amazing way for you to enjoy the exhibition online as well. So that's in the coming weeks. We'll wait to see how things develop on the national front with COVID-19, but I really hope we'll be welcoming people through the doors to see the exhibition online, but in person as well. And then in the meantime, to keep you occupied during May, the Living with Pride programme has a major event like this every month, and other things as well as the year unfolds. So please come back for the next event in the series, which will be on May the 27th. And it's a discussion about the road to marriage equality. We talked about that as well. And our speakers will be, the programme is co-curated by Tonie Walsh, and he'll be moderating this discussion, and joined by Gráinne Healy and Brian Sheehan and Lisa Connell. So I think a great way to keep the conversation going. Can I say thanks again to the wonderful audience who were so positive, great questions and comments throughout, but a really, really special thank you to Bill and Aifric, just from the National Library and for tonight. Thank you both very, very much. Good night, everybody.